Adam never planned to share his quiet world with anyone again, least of all a half-wild creature with haunted eyes and a voice that wouldn't quit. But sometimes life doesn't ask permission before shoving the impossible right onto your doorstep. The phone call came on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day that settled over his land like a damp wool blanket. The local wildlife rehab center was desperate, their usual calm edged with something close to pleading. They had a bobcat, a young female, pulled from a backyard cage outside Hendersonville, neglected for who knows how long, half her fur missing, underweight, nervous, but oddly vocal. So vocal it had become a problem. It'd been days from euthanasia before the rescue. Now she paced her enclosure, talking constantly in little squeaks and broken meows that unsettled the staff. "We've heard about your property," the director said. "Remote, secure. You've worked with injured deer and released them before. If anyone could give her a last chance, it might be you." Adam nearly said no out of habit. The last 2 years had trained him well in retreat. After losing his wife and little boy to a drunk driver on a wet mountain curve, he'd built walls around his grief so thick even air seemed to have trouble getting through. But there was a hesitance in the woman's voice, a desperate hope he couldn't quite silence with polite refusal. "I'll come see her," he said finally, surprising himself. The facility was a low building, ringed by mesh pens and shaded by old sycamores. The staff led him back to a side yard where a small bobcat prowled, her movements jerky, uncertain. She was pitifully thin, her ribs visible under tufts of patchy mottled fur. When Adam stepped closer to the fence, she froze, then let out a sound that didn't belong in any wilderness he knew. It was half squeak, half rolling chirp, like a question voiced on a broken toy whistle. Then she did it again. 3 short chirps, each ending on a tiny warble. "She does that all day," the handler murmured. "Talks to nobody. Or maybe talks to the world, hoping it talks back." Adam crouched, resting his forearms on his knees. The bobcat inched forward, ears pricked, and made another ridiculous sound. This one so bright and oddly hopeful, he felt. Something in his chest twitched like it wanted to live again. "What's her name?" he asked, because somehow she needed one. "We call her Soft because when we first bathed her, her tiny noises were the only thing gentle about her." Adam huffed out a breath that might have been half a laugh. "Soft," he repeated. He pressed her small body against the chain link, tilting her head, pupils wide and round, then gave a low musical trill that rose into a squeak. "All right, Soft," Adam muttered. "Let's see what happens next." They completed paperwork, more invasive than any mortgage he'd ever signed. Permits, land inspections, endless stipulations. Not a pet, they stressed. A managed wildlife case. Needed to roam, stay mentally challenged, keep her instincts sharp. "If she bonds to you, that's one thing," the director told him. "But she'll never be a house cat. Don't expect that. Don't try to force it." Adam didn't promise anything, mostly because he didn't expect to give anything beyond food and safe fences. When he finally brought Soft home, she arrived in a reinforced carrier, curled at the back, watching him with guarded intensity. The moment he opened the door inside the sprawling, secure enclosure he'd constructed, a half-acre patchwork of pine, rocks, logs, and hidden dens, Soft shot out like a shadow. For a moment, Adam thought he'd lost her already. But then she popped up, on a mossy stump 10 yards away, chirped that absurd squeal, and sat down to watch him as if waiting for instructions. The days settled into a rhythm. Adam rose at dawn, drank his coffee on the porch, then walked the perimeter trail with slow, deliberate steps. Sometimes Soft followed him, close, slipping from bush to bush with theatrical stealth before bursting out with a victorious squeal. Other times, she stayed hidden until he least expected it, dropping from a low branch to scamper ahead, chittering at him in rapid-fire tones, like she was reporting urgent gossip. By the third week, Adam found himself talking back, not in long speeches, just little replies. Oh, really? Or that's so? Or well, I suppose you'd know better than me, Soft answered. Every time. Her high-pitched voice a tumble of squeaks and squeals that somehow made perfect sense in the hush of the morning woods. Neighbors started to notice. The mailman jumped clear off the drive one afternoon when Soft erupted from a bush near the gate, gave 2 loud squeaks, and dashed off. Later, he laughed with Adam, shaking his head. That cat of yours has got more to say than half the folks in town. Adam only shrugged. She's not mine. He just decided I was worth bothering. But inside, he felt a small spark of pleasure at the idea. Months passed. Soft's fur grew thick again, lush and gold amber with faint spots that showed when she stretched in the sun. Her limp faded as muscle built under Adam's careful feeding and the natural exercise of chasing squirrels and play-fighting old logs. But her talking never stopped. If anything, it grew more elaborate. Long wavering meows that ended in bubbling trills, little sequences of pops and squeaks that sounded almost like laughter. In the evenings, Adam sat on the porch with a book or just stared into the forest. Shadows. Soft would appear without fail, hop up onto the railing, circle twice, and then start speaking. Sometimes she'd practically scold him, pacing back and forth, squeaking with increasing urgency, until he'd mutter, all right, I'm listening." Then she'd settle down with a huff, press her flank. Then she bolted up the bank, turned in a tight circle, and squealed again, high and delighted. Adam laughed so hard his ribs ached. "You're out of your mind," he wheezed. Soft came trotting back, tail high, gave one more triumphant squeak, then pressed her nose to his knuckles in the gentlest greeting he'd ever felt. In that moment, something cracked all the way open inside him. He realized with a quiet, almost painful relief that he was happy, not in spite of the loss he carried, but right alongside it. Winter deepened. Adam strung fresh cedar boughs around Soft's favorite hollow logs for extra warmth. He set out puzzle feeders with bits of venison, hid treats under piles of leaves just to watch her solve the mystery. Sometimes she'd explode out of nowhere, squeak like a clown horn, then vanish again, only to return minutes later with a look that could only mean, "Did you see how clever I was?" She never tried to run for the forest beyond the enclosure. Maybe because she didn't need to. Adam's land had become hers, and more astonishing, he had become hers, too. The neighbors still called him a recluse, but they didn't know he was never alone anymore. On a bright day in early spring, the Wildlife rehab director visited to renew his permits. She stood in the yard with a clipboard, studying soft as the bobcat, danced around Adam's legs, chittering and squeaking in a breathless tumble of sounds. "I've worked with bobcats for 20 years, the woman said slowly. "I've never seen one talk like this, and certainly not to one person this much. She sounds well happy." Adam stroked Soft's head, feeling her lean fully into the touch. "Yeah," he said, voice rough with emotion. "She tells me about it every day." Soft meowed again, low and oddly tender, then settled with her head on his boot. Together they watched the sun bleed gold into the tops of the maples. The sky deepened from apricot to a dusky violet, the first evening stars trembling awake. Overhead, Adam sat very still, afraid that even shifting his weight might break the fragile perfection of this moment. He could feel Soft's breath, where her cheek pressed against the leather, tiny warm puffs that seemed to echo in his chest. It struck Adam then, just how miraculous it all was. A bobcat, meant to be a ghost in these woods, wild and weary, days from a needle because someone else had failed her so thoroughly, and him, a man meant to fade into the quiet, to let grief hollow him out until there was nothing left but an empty shell with tired eyes. A man who no longer believed surprise had any business knocking on his door. Yet here they were, talking, laughing in their mismatched ways, sharing secrets without words, alive together in the small, bright place between sorrow and grace. Breeze stirred the branches above, sending a hush through the leaves. Was the kind of sound that might have once felt lonely. Now it simply wrapped around them both like a soft hand, resting on their shoulders. Soft twitched her ear, gave a tiny sigh, and snuggled her face deeper against Adam's boot. Her trust stunned him. It was so complete, so undeserved. He blinked hard, swallowing the tight burn in his throat. He didn't rescue Soft. Not really. If anything, her absurd chatter, those squeaks and chirps that sounded like toy horns or half-formed questions, her insistent joy, her fearless demand, that silence never win. They had reached into the grave he'd been living in and pulled him stumbling back toward the sun. She'd reminded him how to answer when life still called out, even if it sounded like the strangest squeak you ever heard. How to smile when absurdity knocked. How to feel warmth again, without guilt. Some nights after he'd gone inside, he could hear her out there, soft talking to the moon, to the crickets, to the stubborn hush of the woods. Her voice would rise and fall, bright and musical, until he found himself chuckling under his breath in the dark. Other nights, he'd catch her, watching him through the window, golden, eyes luminous. Sometimes, she'd give a single little squeak, like a soft hello, before vanishing into the shadows again. It was as if she couldn't quite let him out of her sight for too long. And the truth was, he couldn't let her out of his heart anymore either. And so every morning, Adam stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, and waited for it. The scent of pine and damp earth drifted up to meet him, the promise of another day. It never took long. Somewhere in the pines, a familiar squeal would rise, bright and wild, cutting through the hush with reckless delight. "There you are, Soft," he'd call, and like a promise kept, she came bounding into view, talking nonstop about everything and nothing, filling up all the empty places as if they'd never existed at all.